In the heart of Texas in 1880, there lived a man named John Miller, a 55-year-old laborer who lived a simple and honorable life alongside Sarah Miller, his wife of more than 3 decades. But prepare your heart, because what happened to them will show you the depths of human evil and how the thirst for revenge can awaken a dark side that not even John himself knew existed within him. How can someone who dedicated decades to being honest, fair, and peaceful become something completely different when he loses the thing he loves most? John Miller woke up every day at 5 in the morning, as he had done for the past 30 years. His routine was simple and predictable. He prepared coffee while Sarah still slept, fed the horses in the small stable behind their modest wooden house, and then sat on the porch to contemplate the sunrise over the vast Texas plains. At 55, John had a face marked by time and the relentless western sun, but his blue eyes still shone with the same intensity as when he was young. His hands, calloused from hard work, were firm and precise, characteristics that few in the town of Cedar Creek truly knew. To everyone, John Miller was just an ordinary man, an honest farmer who tended his land with dedication and lived in harmony with his wife Sarah, the beloved local schoolteacher. Sarah Miller, at 50, was a woman of serene beauty and generous heart. Her brown hair, now sprinkled with silver strands, was always pulled back in an elegant bun when she went to school. She had been teaching the children of Cedar Creek for more than 20 years, and there wasn't a single family in town that didn't respect and admire her. Sarah had the gift of making every child feel special, of turning the most difficult lessons into fun games, and of being a second mother to those who needed it. Her sweet voice echoed through the classroom every morning, teaching not just mathematics and reading, but values like honesty, compassion, and justice. John often joked that Sarah was the true soul of Cedar Creek, and he wasn't wrong. The Miller couple lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a few acres of fertile land, where John grew corn, beans, and raised some horses. The property wasn't large, but it was enough to sustain a comfortable and dignified life. John had inherited this land from his father, who in turn had received it from his grandfather, one of the first settlers to establish himself in the region. For John, that land wasn't just a means of subsistence. It was his history, his identity, the place where he built his life alongside Sarah. Every tree, every stone, every corner of that property held precious memories of more than 3 decades of love and companionship. John and Sarah's mornings followed a sacred ritual. After John finished his morning chores, he would return home and find Sarah preparing breakfast. They would sit at the kitchen table, a simple wooden piece that John had made with his own hands right after their wedding, and talk about the day's plans. Sarah would tell him about her students, her concerns about some children who were facing difficulties, her dreams of improving education in town even more. John, in turn, would talk about the weather, about the horses, about small repairs he needed to make on the property. These were simple, everyday conversations, but filled with love and complicity. After coffee, John would walk Sarah to school, strolling through the dirt streets of Cedar Creek, greeting neighbors and watching the town wake up to another day. Cedar Creek was a small town with just over 300 inhabitants, typical of the Texas interior in the 1880s. Main Street was lined with wooden buildings: Marcus Thompson's General Store, Pete Sullivan's Saloon, Old Tom's Barbershop, Sheriff Wade Harrison's office, and the small Methodist church where John and Sarah had married 32 years earlier. The school was at the end of the street, a simple but well-maintained building, painted white with blue windows that Sarah had insisted on to brighten the environment. It was there that Sarah spent most of her days, shaping the young minds of Cedar Creek and planting seeds of hope and knowledge that would flourish for generations. John Miller carried a secret that few knew, a shadow from his past that he had buried deep in his soul. At 17, when he was still an impetuous young man full of energy, John had been involved in a fight that changed his life forever. It all started when he saw his best friend, Tommy Richardson, being beaten by 3 older men outside the school. Tommy was a scrawny and shy boy, son of a poor widow, and often became a target for bullies who enjoyed humiliating the weaker ones. That day, John couldn't stand still watching the injustice. His protective nature and sense of justice spoke louder than prudence, and he threw himself into the fight without hesitation. What John didn't expect was to discover that he possessed extraordinary natural abilities for combat. His reflexes were incredibly fast, his movements precise and lethal, as if he had been born to fight. In a matter of minutes, John had knocked down 2 of the attackers, but the third, a man named Buck Morrison, pulled a knife and lunged at him. Survival instinct took over John, who managed to disarm Morrison and, in a reflexive movement, ended up breaking the man's neck with his bare hands. Buck Morrison died instantly, and John stood there, looking at the lifeless body, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the terrifying realization that he had taken a human life with frightening ease. That moment marked John forever. He realized he carried within himself a capacity for violence that deeply frightened him. In the days following the incident, John spent hours practicing with his father's revolver, discovering that his aim was naturally perfect, that he could draw the weapon with a speed that defied comprehension, and that his combat reflexes were superhuman. It was as if he had been born to be a gunslinger, a warrior, but this discovery filled him with horror instead of pride. John made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would never use these abilities again. He stored his father's revolver at the bottom of a trunk, made a solemn oath to never again engage in violence, and dedicated his life to being a man of peace, honesty, and compassion. For the 38 years that followed, John kept his oath religiously. Even when faced with provocations, insults, or situations that could easily escalate to violence, he always found peaceful ways to resolve conflicts. Sarah knew about John's youth incident and deeply admired the strength of character he demonstrated every day by choosing peace over violence. She often said it was this transformation, this conscious choice to be better, that made her fall in love with him. John had become the most respected man in Cedar Creek, known for his unwavering integrity, his generosity with those in need, and his wisdom in resolving disputes between neighbors. Life in Cedar Creek followed its peaceful rhythm until in early fall of 1880, 3 men arrived in town who would change everything forever. They introduced themselves as businessmen from Dallas, interested in investing in the region and bringing progress to the Texas interior. The group's leader was Charles Blackwood, a man in his early 40s, well-dressed and eloquent, who quickly won the sympathy of many residents with his promises of development and prosperity. Alongside him were his partners, Robert Kane, a corpulent man with a cold stare, and Henry Dalton, younger and apparently more nervous than the other 2. They stayed at the town's only hotel and began circulating through the streets, talking with local merchants and studying the region's properties. Blackwood and his associates had ambitious plans for Cedar Creek. They wanted to build a large cattle station that would serve as a stopping point for herds heading to northern markets, transforming the small town into an important commercial center. The project promised jobs, money, and growth, but there was a problem. The ideal location for the station was exactly where John Miller's property was located. The Miller lands were strategically positioned, with easy access to the main road and close to the river that provided abundant water. Without that property, Blackwood's project simply wouldn't be viable. Charles Blackwood sought out John Miller on a sunny October afternoon. He arrived at the Miller property mounted on an imposing black horse, wearing an expensive suit and a felt hat that contrasted with the simplicity of the rural environment. John was fixing a fence when he saw the visitor approaching and received Blackwood with the courtesy typical of interior residents. Sarah, who was watering flowers in front of the house, also greeted the stranger with a gentle smile and offered coffee, an invitation Blackwood readily accepted. The 3 sat on the porch, and Blackwood began to present his proposal with all the eloquence of an experienced salesman. Blackwood's offer was generous, at least in financial terms. He offered John an amount that represented almost 10 times the real value of the property, enough money for the Miller couple to move to a larger city and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Blackwood painted a seductive picture of possibilities. John and Sarah could buy an elegant house in Dallas or San Antonio. Sarah could teach in better-equipped schools, and they could enjoy all the comforts of urban life. He spoke about theaters, restaurants, libraries, modern hospitals, everything that a small town like Cedar Creek couldn't offer. His presentation was convincing and passionate, but John and Sarah exchanged glances that communicated more than words could express. John politely thanked Blackwood for the offer, but explained that that land represented much more than money to him and his wife. It was the place where they built their life together, where every precious memory was engraved in the soil and trees. It was where they intended to grow old and be buried, alongside John's parents and grandparents who helped colonize the region. Sarah added that her students needed her, that Cedar Creek was their home, and that she couldn't imagine life anywhere else. They were firm but respectful in their refusal, hoping Blackwood would understand and respect their decision. The businessman maintained his smile throughout the conversation, but John, with his life experience, noticed that the gleam in the man's eyes had changed when he heard the negative response. Blackwood didn't give up easily. In the weeks that followed, he returned to the Miller property several times, always with new offers and different arguments. He increased the financial proposal, offered partnership in his businesses, promised to build a new school in Cedar Creek if they sold the land, and even suggested they could keep a small part of the property as a keepsake. Each visit was polite and apparently friendly, but John began to perceive a subtle pressure in Blackwood's words, an insistence that bordered on obsession. Sarah also noticed the change in the businessman's behavior and confided to John that she felt uncomfortable with the intensity of his interest in their land. The situation became complicated when Blackwood began spreading rumors throughout town about the benefits his project would bring to all Cedar Creek residents. He organized meetings at Pete Sullivan's saloon, where he presented detailed maps and plans showing how the cattle station would transform the local economy. Many residents became excited about the possibilities of growth and prosperity, and some began pressuring John to reconsider his decision. Marcus Thompson, the general store owner, argued that the project would benefit the entire community and that John was being selfish by refusing to sell. Other residents, influenced by Blackwood's promises, began to see John as an obstacle to the town's progress. John found himself in a difficult and uncomfortable position. He had always been respected and admired in Cedar Creek, but now he felt disapproving looks and heard whispered comments when he walked through the streets. Some of his closest neighbors remained loyal and understanding, but the division in the community was evident. Sarah suffered even more from the situation, as some parents began questioning whether she should continue teaching their children, suggesting that a person who prevented the town's progress might not be the ideal influence for children. These criticisms deeply wounded Sarah, who had dedicated her entire life to education and the welfare of Cedar Creek's children. During this tense period, John began noticing strange things happening on his property. Fences were cut during the night, allowing cattle to scatter and cause damage to crops. Tools mysteriously disappeared from the stable, and on one occasion, John found strange footprints around his house, as if someone had been watching during the night. He reported these incidents to Sheriff Wade Harrison, a middle-aged man who had assumed the position just 2 years earlier after the old sheriff retired. Harrison listened to John's complaints with apparent interest, promised to investigate, but never seemed to find evidence or suspects. John began to suspect that the problems on his property weren't coincidences, but he had no concrete proof to support his suspicions. Sheriff Wade Harrison was an ambitious man who had arrived in Cedar Creek with big plans to make a career in law enforcement. He was originally from a larger city and often spoke about his influential contacts and his aspirations to become a federal officer. Harrison was about 40 years old, was good-looking, and knew how to impress people with his rhetoric about law and order. However, those who knew him more intimately, like Pete Sullivan, the saloon owner, knew that Harrison had a greedy side and wasn't averse to accepting favors from people who could help his career. When Charles Blackwood arrived in town with his grandiose plans and his well-filled wallet, Harrison saw a golden opportunity to advance his own interests. Blackwood didn't take long to realize that Sheriff Harrison could be a valuable ally in his efforts to acquire the Miller property. He began cultivating a friendship with the officer, inviting him to expensive dinners at the hotel, offering Cuban cigars and imported whiskey, and talking about the opportunities that would arise when his project was operational. Harrison was impressed with the luxurious lifestyle that Blackwood represented and began dreaming about the possibilities that a partnership with the businessman could bring. Blackwood, in turn, was careful in his approaches, never offering direct bribes, but making it clear that those who helped him would be generously rewarded when his enterprise was successful. The pressure on John and Sarah continued to increase during the winter of 1880. Blackwood had established a permanent presence in Cedar Creek, renting an office on Main Street and hiring some local residents to work on his preliminary projects. He became an influential figure in the community, sponsoring social events, donating money to the church, and always talking about the prosperous future awaiting Cedar Creek. His strategy was clear: isolate John and Sarah, making them appear as selfish obstacles to the entire community's welfare. The tactic was working, and the Miller couple found themselves increasingly alone in their resistance to Blackwood's plans. Sarah began facing growing difficulties in her work as a teacher. Some parents withdrew their children from school, claiming they wanted education in a more progressive institution. Other parents began questioning her teaching methods and criticizing the curriculum she had developed over decades of experience. Sarah knew these criticisms had no pedagogical foundation, but were motivated by political pressure related to her husband's refusal to sell the property. She tried to maintain dignity and continue doing her work in the best way possible, but the situation was deeply affecting her emotional well-being. John saw his wife suffering and felt growing anger against those who were using such low tactics to pressure his family. On a cold January night in 1881, John was awakened by strange noises coming from the stable. He got up silently, took a lantern, and went out to investigate, leaving Sarah sleeping. What he found made him furious. Someone had cut his horse's reins and scattered nails across the stable floor, clearly with the intention of injuring the animals. John examined the damage by lantern light, and his analytical mind began connecting the dots of all the strange incidents that had occurred in recent months. He realized he was being targeted by a systematic intimidation campaign designed to make his life so difficult that he would be forced to accept Blackwood's offer. The discovery awakened in John an anger he hadn't felt in decades, a cold and controlled fury that dangerously reminded him of his violent past. The morning after the stable incident, John made a decision that would irreversibly change the course of events. He sought out Charles Blackwood at his temporary office on Cedar Creek's Main Street, determined to have a frank conversation about the attacks on his property. John entered the office with the upright posture and firm gaze of a man who wouldn't be intimidated, and found Blackwood sitting behind a makeshift desk, examining maps and documents. The businessman looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, greeted John with false cordiality, and offered a chair as if he were the most hospitable host in the world. John refused the seat and went straight to the point, describing the incidents that had occurred on his property and making it clear he knew they weren't coincidences. Blackwood listened to John's accusations with an expression of apparently genuine surprise, denying any involvement in the incidents and suggesting they might be the work of mischievous youth or even wild animals. His performance was convincing, but John had learned to read people over his 55 years of life and could see through the businessman's facade of innocence. Blackwood then changed tactics, adopting a more serious and paternal tone, explaining that sometimes progress encounters resistance and that people with established interests might feel threatened by changes. He suggested that perhaps some local residents were trying to convince John to reconsider his position, and that the best way to end these problems would be simply to accept the generous offer that had been on the table for months. John left Blackwood's office with absolute certainty that the businessman was behind the attacks on his property, but without concrete evidence he could present to Sheriff Harrison. He knew Harrison was increasingly close to Blackwood, and that any complaint would be received with skepticism or simply ignored. John found himself in an impossible situation. He was being systematically attacked and intimidated, but those responsible were too smart to leave evidence, and local authorities were compromised. He returned home with a heavy heart, knowing he would have to find a way to protect Sarah and his property without resorting to the violent methods he had sworn never to use again. Sarah immediately noticed that something was deeply troubling her husband. During dinner that night, she noticed John was quieter than usual, his blue eyes heavy with a concern he was trying to hide. When she asked about his conversation with Blackwood, John hesitated before responding, not wanting to worry his wife with details about the threats they faced. He told her about the meeting superficially, mentioning only that he had made it clear to Blackwood that he wouldn't change his mind about selling the property. Sarah, however, knew her husband too well to be fooled by half-truths and insisted he share his real concerns. John finally gave in and told her about the incidents on the property, about his suspicions regarding Blackwood, and about his growing certainty that they were being targeted by an intimidation campaign. The revelation left Sarah deeply disturbed, but also strengthened her determination not to give in to pressure. She held John's hands across the kitchen table, looked into the eyes of the man she had loved for more than 3 decades, and declared they would face together any challenge that arose. Sarah reminded John of all the difficulties they had overcome throughout their marriage, the droughts that destroyed entire crops, the premature death of their parents, the difficult years when the local economy was in crisis, and they had always found strength in each other to persevere. She said she wouldn't allow greedy and unscrupulous men to drive them from the land that was their home, and that she would rather face any consequence than live with the shame of having given in to intimidation. Sarah's words rekindled the flame of determination in John's heart, and he felt renewed pride for the extraordinary woman he had chosen as his life companion. In the days that followed, John implemented security measures to protect his property and his wife. He began making regular nighttime rounds, carrying a lantern and a stick, checking fences, the stable and the house surroundings. John also asked some of his most trusted neighbors, like old Tom, the barber, and Marcus Thompson, despite the pressure the latter faced, to stay alert for suspicious activities in the area. He installed new locks on the house doors and windows, and even considered the possibility of asking for help from the retired old sheriff, an upright man named Bill Crawford, who still lived in town and maintained the respect of all honest residents. During this tense period, Sarah continued her work as a teacher with renewed determination, refusing to allow political pressures to affect the education of children who still attended her school. She noticed that some of her favorite students, like little Emma Thompson, Marcus's daughter, seemed worried and confused by the tensions dividing the community. Sarah made sure to maintain a positive and safe learning environment in her classroom, protecting children from adult disputes and continuing to teach the values of honesty, courage, and compassion that had always been the foundation of her pedagogy. She knew her work was more important than ever, especially in times of division and conflict. The situation in Cedar Creek continued to deteriorate during the first months of 1881. Blackwood had managed to win the support of most local merchants, promising lucrative contracts and business opportunities when his cattle station was operational. Sheriff Harrison had become an open ally of the businessman, frequently being seen in his company and publicly defending the development plans. Social pressure on John and Sarah intensified, with some residents going so far as to avoid greeting them on the streets or crossing to the other side when they saw them approaching. The Miller couple found themselves increasingly isolated, sustained only by the support of some loyal friends and the strength of their union. On a March afternoon, Sarah was teaching her students about American history when she was interrupted by a commotion outside the school. She looked out the window and saw a group of men carrying an unconscious child toward Dr. Samuel Hayes's office, Cedar Creek's only doctor. Sarah immediately recognized the child. It was Tommy Peterson, an 8-year-old boy, son of a poor family living on the outskirts of town. Tommy was one of her most beloved students, a sweet and intelligent child who often stayed after class to help Sarah clean the room and organize materials. Worried, Sarah dismissed her students early and ran to the medical office to find out what had happened to Tommy. Dr. Hayes was examining the boy when Sarah arrived at the office, accompanied by Tommy's desperate parents. The doctor, a 60-year-old man with decades of experience, seemed deeply concerned about the child's condition. Tommy was unconscious, with pale skin and cold sweats, presenting symptoms that Dr. Hayes immediately recognized as poisoning. The doctor explained to the parents and Sarah that the boy had ingested some toxic substance, possibly arsenic, and that his condition was critical. He was doing everything he could to save Tommy's life, but admitted the next few hours would be decisive. The news devastated Tommy's mother, who broke down in tears, while the father was paralyzed by shock and despair. Sarah remained at the office throughout the night, helping Dr. Hayes care for Tommy and offering emotional support to the child's parents. She held the boy's hand, whispered words of encouragement in his ear, and prayed silently for his recovery. John arrived at the office as soon as he learned what had happened, bringing coffee and food for everyone present and offering any help that might be needed. The Miller couple had developed a special affection for Tommy over the years, as the boy frequently visited their property to help with small tasks in exchange for a few coins and always a snack lovingly prepared by Sarah. Seeing the child fighting for his life awakened in both a deep anguish and fierce determination to do everything within their power to help. Despite Dr. Hayes' heroic efforts and the love and care of everyone present, Tommy Peterson died in the early hours of the following morning. His death was a devastating blow to the entire Cedar Creek community, but especially to Sarah, who had watched the boy grow and develop under her care at school. Tommy's funeral was one of the saddest the town had ever witnessed, with practically all residents attending to pay their last respects to the innocent child. Sarah wept copiously during the ceremony, firmly holding John's hand, while the local pastor spoke about the brevity of life and the mysteries of divine will. Tommy's death left a void in the hearts of all who knew him, but no one could imagine how this tragic event would be used as a weapon against innocent people. 2 days after Tommy Peterson's funeral, Sheriff Wade Harrison appeared at the Miller property with a somber and determined expression. John was working in the garden when he saw the officer approaching on horseback and immediately sensed something was wrong from Harrison's tense posture. Sarah was inside the house, preparing lunch, when she heard raised voices outside. She came out to the porch and found Harrison delivering an official document to John, explaining that he had received a formal complaint accusing Sarah Miller of poisoning Tommy Peterson. The accusation was so absurd and shocking that Sarah initially thought it was some kind of misunderstanding or bad joke, but the sheriff's serious expression soon made it clear he was speaking seriously. Harrison explained that a witness had come forward, claiming to have seen Sarah give something to Tommy to eat the day before his death. The witness alleged that Sarah had offered the boy a piece of pie that was visibly spoiled, and that she had insisted he eat it, even when Tommy showed reluctance. According to the complaint, Sarah had acted suspiciously and nervously during the incident, and had threatened Tommy if he told anyone about what had happened. The accusation was so ridiculous and contrary to everything anyone who knew Sarah understood about her character, that John initially laughed, thinking Harrison was testing his reaction. However, when he realized the sheriff was serious, John felt a cold anger begin to grow in his chest. Sarah was completely shocked by the accusation, her legs trembling so much that she had to lean on the porch railing to avoid falling. The idea that someone could accuse her of harming a child, especially Tommy, whom she loved as if he were her own grandson, was so absurd that she couldn't fully process what was happening. Sarah tried to explain to Harrison that she had given food to Tommy hundreds of times over the years, always with his parents' knowledge and approval, and that she would never do anything that could harm a child. She begged the sheriff to investigate properly before giving credence to such unfounded accusations. But Harrison maintained a cold and professional expression, saying he was just fulfilling his duty as a law officer. John demanded to know who the witness was who had made the accusation, but Harrison refused to reveal the identity, claiming he needed to protect the person from possible retaliation. He said Sarah would have to accompany him to jail to give testimony and await a preliminary hearing with the local judge. John protested vehemently, arguing that Sarah was a woman respected in the community for decades, who had dedicated her entire life to children's welfare, and that the accusation was obviously a farce. He demanded that Harrison investigate properly before arresting an innocent person, but the sheriff responded that he was just following legal procedures and that Sarah would be treated with all due dignity until the facts were clarified. Sarah, despite the shock and fear, maintained her dignity and composure. She told John she would cooperate with the investigation because she knew her innocence would be quickly proven and that she had nothing to fear from the truth. Sarah kissed her husband, asked him to take care of the house and animals, and followed Harrison toward town, walking with her head held high despite the tears silently running down her face. John stood on the porch, watching his wife walk away, feeling a mixture of despair, anger, and a terrible premonition that something much worse was coming. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the accusation against Sarah wasn't a misunderstanding, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan to destroy his family. News of Sarah Miller's arrest spread through Cedar Creek like wildfire. Within hours, the entire town was talking about the shocking accusation against the respected teacher. Reactions were divided. Those who had known Sarah for years were incredulous and indignant, refusing to believe she could be capable of harming a child. However, other residents, especially those who had been influenced by Blackwood's campaign against the Millers, began whispering that perhaps there had always been something strange about the family, and that John's obstinate refusal to sell his property could be a sign of a darker nature than it appeared. The division in the community deepened even further, with families and friends finding themselves on opposite sides of an issue that touched the moral heart of Cedar Creek's identity. John spent the night awake, walking through the empty house and trying to understand how his life had transformed into a nightmare in a matter of hours. He knew Sarah was completely innocent, but also realized he was facing forces much more powerful and organized than he had imagined. The accusation against his wife was so specific and detailed that it had obviously been carefully planned, and John began to suspect that Tommy Peterson's death hadn't been accidental, but part of an elaborate conspiracy to frame Sarah. The idea that someone could be capable of killing an innocent child just to get his property filled John with a fury he hadn't felt in decades, a cold and implacable rage that awakened dangerous memories of his violent past. The next morning, John sought out Dr. Hayes to discuss the details of Tommy Peterson's death. The doctor was visibly disturbed by the accusation against Sarah, as he knew the teacher's character and knew she would be incapable of harming any child. Dr. Hayes explained to John that Tommy had died from arsenic poisoning, a substance that could have been administered in food or drink several hours before symptoms appeared. The doctor admitted he hadn't conducted a detailed investigation into the poison's source, as he was focused on trying to save the boy's life, but agreed it would be important to examine all possibilities. John asked Dr. Hayes to document everything he could remember about Tommy's condition and the symptoms he had observed, as he suspected this information would be crucial to proving Sarah's innocence. Sarah's preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 days after her arrest, enough time for tensions in Cedar Creek to reach a boiling point. John spent those days trying to gather evidence of his wife's innocence and discover the identity of the mysterious witness who had made the accusation. He talked with all neighbors who might have seen Sarah on the day of Tommy's death, visited the Peterson family to express his condolences and try to better understand what had happened, and even sought out the local church pastor to ask for moral and spiritual support. However, John began to realize that his investigation attempts were being systematically blocked, as if invisible forces were working to prevent the truth from coming to light. The judge responsible for the case was Horace Whitman, a 65-year-old man who had served as magistrate in Cedar Creek for more than 2 decades. Whitman had a reputation for being fair but rigorous, a man who followed the law to the letter and didn't tolerate disorder in his court. However, John noticed the judge seemed strangely anxious to accelerate the process, scheduling the hearing as soon as possible and refusing postponement requests that would allow for a more complete investigation. When John tried to speak with Whitman about inconsistencies in the accusation against Sarah, the judge was cold and distant, saying all questions would be resolved during the formal trial and that it wasn't appropriate to discuss the case outside court. On the morning of the hearing, John arrived at the improvised courthouse in Pete Sullivan's saloon, which had been temporarily converted to accommodate the legal proceeding. He found Sarah sitting in a chair in the center of the room, wearing her best blue dress and maintaining an upright posture despite the terrible circumstances. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and John saw in her gaze a mixture of fear, determination, and an unwavering love that strengthened him to face what was coming. Sarah smiled weakly at her husband, a courageous gesture that broke John's heart, and at the same time filled him with pride for the extraordinary woman he had chosen as his life companion. Judge Whitman opened the session with his grave and authoritative voice, explaining that this was a preliminary hearing to determine if there was sufficient evidence to bring Sarah Miller to trial for Tommy Peterson's death. The accusation was formally read: willful homicide by poisoning, a crime that could result in the death penalty if Sarah were found guilty. The silence that followed the reading of the accusation was broken only by the muffled sobs of some women in the audience who couldn't believe they were hearing such words being directed against the gentle teacher who had educated their children with such care and dedication. The prosecution's main witness was then called to testify, and John felt his blood freeze when he saw who stood up to address the center of the room. It was Martha Hendricks, a middle-aged woman who had arrived in Cedar Creek just a few weeks earlier, claiming to be a widow looking for a quiet place to restart her life. Martha was a stranger in the community, without family ties or history in the region, but had quickly integrated into the social circle that supported Blackwood's plans. John immediately realized that Martha's choice as a witness wasn't coincidence, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan to frame Sarah using someone who had no emotional connections to the community and could lie without embarrassment. Martha Hendricks gave her testimony with a confidence that impressed many of those present, but left John deeply suspicious. She described in detail how she had seen Sarah offering food to Tommy Peterson the day before his death, claiming the pie appeared spoiled and that Sarah had insisted the boy eat it, even when he showed reluctance. Martha stated she had found Sarah's behavior strange at the time, but had only understood the gravity of the situation after Tommy's death. Her testimony was detailed and convincing, but John noticed small inconsistencies in her story, details that didn't align with what he knew about his wife's habits and personality. When Sarah had the opportunity to defend herself, she did so with the dignity and honesty that had characterized her entire life. She admitted she frequently gave food to Tommy and other children, but vehemently denied offering anything that could be spoiled or contaminated. Sarah explained she always prepared fresh snacks for children who visited her, and that Tommy was especially dear to her and John, being treated almost like a grandson. She begged the judge and those present to consider her decades-long record dedicated to Cedar Creek children's welfare, and asked why anyone would believe she could be capable of harming a child she loved so much. Her words were sincere and moving, but John could see in some faces that the seed of doubt had already been planted. Dr. Hayes was called to testify about the cause of Tommy's death, and his testimony confirmed the boy had died from arsenic poisoning. However, when questioned about the poison's source, the doctor admitted he hadn't conducted a complete investigation and that arsenic could have been administered in several different ways. John tried to ask questions about other possible contamination sources, but was silenced by the judge, who said such questions would be addressed during a formal trial if the hearing determined there was sufficient evidence to proceed with the case. After hearing all testimonies, Judge Whitman retired to deliberate, leaving the room in tense and expectant silence. John held Sarah's hand during the wait, whispering words of encouragement and promising he would fight to the end to prove her innocence. Sarah responded with the same courage she had demonstrated throughout the process, saying she trusted in justice and knew the truth would prevail. However, both could feel the hostile atmosphere in the room, the subtle but powerful influence of forces working against them, and a growing premonition that justice might not be as blind as it should be. When Judge Whitman returned, his expression was somber and determined. He announced there was sufficient evidence to bring Sarah Miller to trial for willful homicide, and that she would remain imprisoned until the trial could be held. The decision was received with a mixture of shocked gasps and murmurs of approval, depending on where each person stood in the division that had split the Cedar Creek community. John felt as if he had been punched in the stomach, but maintained his composure for Sarah, who received the news with a dignity that impressed even her detractors. She was taken back to the local jail, a small wooden building behind the sheriff's office, where she would await her fate in a damp and poorly lit cell. Sarah's trial was scheduled for 2 weeks later, time John used to desperately try to find evidence that could save his wife. He hired a lawyer from a neighboring town, a man named Benjamin Foster, who had experience in criminal cases, but who admitted it would be difficult to combat an eyewitness's testimony without concrete evidence contradicting her version of events. John also tried to investigate Martha Hendricks's background, but discovered she had appeared in Cedar Creek without references or verifiable history, as if she had emerged from nowhere specifically to testify against Sarah. His suspicions about a conspiracy strengthened, but he couldn't find concrete proof he could present in court. During the 2 weeks preceding the trial, John visited Sarah in jail every day, bringing homemade food and offering all the emotional support he could. He watched his wife slowly waste away in the cold and damp cell, her health deteriorating due to stress and poor conditions. Sarah maintained her faith and dignity, but John could see fear growing in her eyes, especially when she asked about the chances of being acquitted. John tried to maintain an optimism he didn't feel, promising everything would be fine and that they would soon be together at home again. But deep in his heart, he knew the forces arrayed against them were too powerful to be defeated by conventional methods. Sarah Miller's trial began on a cold April morning in 1881, with the entire population of Cedar Creek gathered in Pete Sullivan's saloon, which had once again been converted into a courthouse. The atmosphere was charged with tension and expectation, with residents divided between those who still believed in Sarah's innocence and others who had been convinced of her guilt by the systematic defamation campaign. John arrived early and sat in the front row, wearing his best suit and maintaining a determined expression, despite the anguish consuming his heart. He watched Sarah being brought into the room, noticing how she had lost weight during the weeks in prison, but admiring the dignity with which she kept her head held high before the crowd judging her. The public prosecutor, a young and ambitious man named Richard Caldwell, presented the case against Sarah with an eloquence that impressed many of those present. Caldwell had arrived in Cedar Creek just a few days before the trial, sent by the state government to ensure justice was done, in the case that had attracted regional attention. He described Sarah as a woman who had hidden her true nature for decades, using her respected position in the community to gain families' trust before committing her heinous crime. Caldwell painted a picture of Sarah as a disturbed and dangerous person who had poisoned an innocent child in an act of inexplicable evil, and asked the jury to do justice by condemning her to death. Benjamin Foster, the defense attorney hired by John, did the best he could with the limited evidence at his disposal. He presented character witnesses who spoke about Sarah's dedication to children over decades, her impeccable reputation in the community, and the impossibility that such a gentle and loving woman could commit such a terrible crime. Foster questioned Martha Hendricks's credibility, pointing out she was a stranger in the community with no verifiable history, and suggested there could be other explanations for Tommy Peterson's death. However, without physical evidence or witnesses who directly contradicted Martha's testimony, Foster was fighting against a current that seemed impossible to reverse. Martha Hendricks repeated her testimony with the same confidence as the preliminary hearing, adding even more details that made her story more convincing. She described the strange expression on Sarah's face when she offered the pie to Tommy, claimed to have heard Sarah whisper something threatening to the boy, and even stated she had seen Sarah throw away the rest of the pie suspiciously after Tommy had eaten only one piece. Each detail of her testimony seemed carefully crafted, to eliminate any doubt about Sarah's guilt, and John realized he was watching a masterful performance by a professional liar who had been specifically trained for this moment. The trial's turning point came when Prosecutor Caldwell presented evidence that no one had mentioned previously. He produced a small bottle he claimed had been found hidden in the Miller house, containing arsenic residue. Caldwell explained the bottle had been discovered during a more detailed search of the property, conducted after Sarah's arrest, and that it represented definitive proof she had planned the poisoning. The revelation caused an uproar in the room, with many present gasping in shock, while John felt his world completely collapse. He knew the bottle was planted evidence, but had no way to prove it, and could see in the jurors' faces that the supposed discovery had sealed his wife's fate. Benjamin Foster protested vehemently against the introduction of evidence that hadn't been mentioned during the initial investigation, arguing it was highly suspicious that such a crucial item had been discovered only after weeks of searches. He questioned the evidence's chain of custody and suggested the bottle could have been planted by people interested in framing Sarah. However, Judge Whitman rejected Foster's objections, declaring the evidence was relevant and admissible, and that any questions about its authenticity could be addressed during witness cross-examination. John realized at that moment that the judicial system that should protect his wife had been completely corrupted, and that Sarah was being sacrificed on an altar of greed and political ambition. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. The decision was announced by Judge Whitman with a solemnity that contrasted with the flagrant injustice being committed, and Sarah received the news with a composure that broke the hearts of all who truly knew her. John felt as if he had been struck by lightning, his mind refusing to accept that his innocent wife had been condemned for a crime she didn't commit. He stood up from his chair intending to protest, but Sarah looked at him with an expression that begged him to maintain dignity, even in the face of the greatest injustice of their lives. Judge Whitman sentenced Sarah Miller to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for the following morning. The sentence's swiftness shocked even those who believed in her guilt, as it was uncommon for executions to be carried out so quickly after a trial. John begged for more time to appeal the decision, but Whitman declared the case was clear, and there was no reason to prolong the community's suffering. Sarah was taken back to jail to spend her last night on earth, while John stood in the empty courthouse, feeling as if his soul had been torn from his body. He knew he had less than 24 hours to save the woman he loved, but also realized that all legal and civilized methods had failed. That night, John visited Sarah for the last time in jail, finding her kneeling in prayer in the cold and damp cell. She stood when she saw him and ran to the bars, extending her hands to touch the face of the man she had loved for more than 3 decades. Sarah told John she wasn't afraid of death because she knew she was innocent and that God knew the truth in her heart. She asked John not to let himself be consumed by bitterness or the thirst for revenge, to continue being the good and honest man she had loved all her life. Sarah made John promise he would find a way to move forward, to find peace and purpose, even without her by his side. John held his wife's hands through the bars, promising everything she asked, but knowing in his heart that some promises are impossible to keep. Sarah Miller's execution was carried out the following morning, before a crowd that had gathered in Cedar Creek Central Square. John was present, standing in the front row with tears silently running down his face, determined to be with Sarah until the last moment. She was brought to the scaffold with her hands tied but keeping her head held high, and an expression of serene peace that impressed even her detractors. Sarah looked for John in the crowd, their eyes meeting one last time, and she whispered, "I love you," before the rope was placed around her neck. The moment of execution was quick, but for John it seemed to last an eternity, each second engraved in his memory with painful clarity that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When Sarah's body stopped moving, John felt something die inside him, something that had been the essence of his humanity for more than 5 decades. The pain of loss was so intense he could barely breathe, but along with the pain came something darker and more dangerous, a cold and implacable rage that awakened memories of his violent past that he had tried to bury forever. John looked at the crowd around the scaffold, his eyes fixing on Charles Blackwood, who watched the execution with an expression of barely disguised satisfaction. In that moment, John Miller, the peaceful and honest man, died along with his wife, and something much more dangerous was born in his place. After Sarah's burial, John returned to his empty and silent house, where every object, every corner, every memory reminded him of the woman he had lost. He sat in the kitchen, at the same table where they had shared thousands of meals and conversations, and for the first time in 38 years, John Miller broke the oath he had made in his youth. He went to the bedroom, opened the trunk where he had stored his father's revolver decades before, and held the weapon in his hands, feeling the familiar weight of metal and the muscle memory of skills he had sworn never to use again. John cleaned and loaded the revolver with precise and automatic movements, his fingers instinctively remembering techniques he had mastered in his turbulent youth. That night, John began his transformation from a man of peace into something much darker and more terrible. He spent hours practicing with the revolver in the barn, rediscovering the supernatural speed of his draw and the deadly precision of his aim. His abilities returned as if they had never been abandoned, perhaps even enhanced by maturity and life experience. John also began planning his revenge with the same meticulousness that had characterized his life as a farmer, studying the habits and movements of each person involved in the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. He knew that Charles Blackwood, Martha Hendricks, Sheriff Wade Harrison, Judge Horace Whitman, and Prosecutor Richard Caldwell had worked together to murder his wife, and each of them would pay a terrible price for their participation in the crime. John's first victim of revenge was Martha Hendricks, the false witness who had sealed Sarah's fate with her elaborate lies. John followed her for several days, learning her routine and waiting for the perfect moment to act. Martha was staying at a boarding house on the outskirts of town, and John discovered she had the habit of walking alone to the river every morning, supposedly to contemplate nature and find spiritual peace. In reality, John suspected she was preparing to leave Cedar Creek now that her work was complete, but he wouldn't allow her to escape the consequences of her actions. On a foggy morning, John waited for Martha on the trail leading to the river, hidden among the trees like a predator waiting for its prey. When Martha appeared, walking carelessly down the trail, John emerged from the shadows with his revolver drawn. The expression of terror on the woman's face when she recognized him was the first real satisfaction John had felt since Sarah's death. Martha tried to run, but John caught her easily, his agility and physical strength still impressive despite being 55 years old. He forced Martha to kneel on the riverbank and demanded she confess the truth about her false testimony. Initially, Martha tried to maintain her story, but when John pressed the revolver barrel against her temple, she broke down and admitted everything. How she had been hired by Blackwood to lie, how they had rehearsed her testimony, how the arsenic bottle had been planted in the Miller house. John listened to every word of the confession with dark satisfaction, engraving every detail in his memory before executing Martha with a single shot to the head. Martha Hendricks' death was discovered the next day by a local fisherman and caused an uproar in Cedar Creek. Sheriff Harrison began a superficial investigation, but John had been careful not to leave evidence that could link him to the crime. The community was divided between those who saw the death as a tragic coincidence and others who suspected someone was seeking revenge for Sarah Miller's execution. Charles Blackwood was visibly nervous about the news, and John noticed the businessman had increased his personal security, hiring 2 thugs to accompany him during his movements around town. However, John knew no amount of protection would be enough to save Blackwood from the retribution that was coming. John's next target was Prosecutor Richard Caldwell, the ambitious young man who had orchestrated Sarah's conviction with such eloquence and determination. Caldwell had remained in Cedar Creek for a few days after the trial, supposedly to finalize case documentation, but John suspected he was being paid by Blackwood to ensure there would be no subsequent legal complications. John discovered Caldwell had the habit of drinking alone at Pete Sullivan's saloon every night. Celebrating his legal victory, and planning how to use the case to advance his career. It was a predictable routine that offered John the perfect opportunity for his second revenge. On a dark and moonless night, John waited for Caldwell to leave the saloon in his usual state of intoxication. The prosecutor staggered down Main Street, humming softly and completely oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. John followed him to a dark alley between two buildings, where he confronted Caldwell with the revolver pointed at his chest. The prosecutor initially tried to use his legal authority to intimidate John, threatening him with arrest and execution for threatening a government officer. However, when he realized he was facing a man who had nothing left to lose, Caldwell began begging for his life, offering money and promising to leave town forever if John spared him. John forced Caldwell to admit his participation in the conspiracy against Sarah, and the prosecutor, terrified, confessed he had been hired by Blackwood to ensure a quick and definitive conviction. Caldwell revealed he had received a substantial amount to present fabricated evidence and manipulate the trial, and that he had known from the beginning that Sarah was innocent. The confession confirmed all of John's suspicions about the extent of corruption that had destroyed his life, and he executed Caldwell with 2 shots to the chest, leaving the body in the alley to be discovered the next morning. The prosecutor's death sent shockwaves through the region's legal community, and John knew his revenge campaign was beginning to attract attention from state authorities. Sheriff Wade Harrison was next on John's list, and perhaps the most dangerous of his targets due to his position and combat training. Harrison had become increasingly paranoid after Martha and Caldwell's deaths, correctly suspecting someone was systematically eliminating everyone involved in the conspiracy against Sarah Miller. The sheriff had begun traveling always armed and accompanied, and rarely left his office after nightfall. John knew he would have to be especially careful and creative to eliminate Harrison without exposing himself to unnecessary risks. The opportunity arose when John discovered Harrison had a secret meeting scheduled with Charles Blackwood at an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town. John suspected the two were planning their escape from Cedar Creek, realizing their conspiracy was being discovered and their lives were in danger. He arrived at the cabin before the meeting and hid in the loft, waiting patiently while Harrison and Blackwood discussed their escape plans. John heard the entire conversation, once again confirming the extent of their betrayal and the coldness with which they had planned Sarah's death to get his property. When Harrison prepared to leave the cabin, John silently descended from the loft and confronted him at the door. The sheriff was an experienced man in combat and reacted quickly, drawing his weapon and trying to shoot John. However, John's supernatural speed with the revolver, enhanced by decades of secret practice and fueled by an implacable thirst for revenge, proved superior. John drew and fired before Harrison could complete his movement, hitting the sheriff in the heart with precision that would have impressed the most legendary gunslingers of the Old West. Harrison fell dead instantly, and John turned to face Charles Blackwood, who had watched the duel with an expression of absolute terror. Blackwood tried to negotiate with John, offering him money, properties, anything that could save his life. He admitted his guilt in the conspiracy against Sarah, but argued it had been just business, nothing personal, and that John could have everything he wanted if he just spared him. John listened to Blackwood's pleas with a cold and implacable expression, remembering how the businessman had watched Sarah's execution with satisfaction. He told Blackwood that some actions cannot be forgiven, some crimes cannot be compensated with money, and that Sarah's death demanded retribution that only blood could pay. John executed Blackwood with a single shot to the head, ending the life of the man who had orchestrated his family's destruction. John's last target was Judge Horace Whitman, the man who had presided over the trial farce that condemned Sarah to death. Whitman was the most protected of all the conspirators, surrounded by guards and rarely leaving his fortified house in the town center. John knew eliminating the judge would be the greatest challenge of his revenge campaign, but also the most important, as Whitman represented the corruption of the very justice system that should have protected Sarah. John spent days studying the judge's routine, looking for a weakness in his security he could exploit. The opportunity came when John discovered Whitman had the habit of secretly visiting a prostitute at a discreet house on the outskirts of town. The judge made these visits once a week, always alone and always by the same route, trusting in the darkness's discretion to hide his immoral activities. John waited for Whitman on the road leading to the prostitute's house, hidden behind a large rock that offered perfect cover. When the judge passed mounted on his horse, John emerged from the shadows and knocked him from the saddle with an accurate shot to the leg, immobilizing him without killing him immediately. John dragged Whitman to a nearby clearing, where he confronted him about his participation in the conspiracy that had killed Sarah. The judge initially tried to deny any irregularity, claiming he had followed the law and that Sarah had been convicted based on legitimate evidence. However, when John threatened to torture him slowly to death, Whitman broke and confessed he had been bribed by Blackwood to ensure a quick and definitive conviction. The judge revealed he had received a substantial amount to accelerate the process and reject any appeal or clemency request. John listened to the confession with dark satisfaction, knowing he had finally obtained definitive proof of the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. John executed Judge Whitman with the same coldness he had shown with the other conspirators, but this time he felt a sense of completion, as if a terrible chapter of his life was finally coming to an end. He had avenged Sarah's death, eliminating all those responsible for her unjust execution, but the victory didn't bring the peace he had expected. Instead, John found himself empty and lost, a man who had fulfilled his mission of revenge, but now didn't know how to continue living. He returned to his empty house, where he sat in the silent kitchen and contemplated the uncertain future that stretched before him. In the days following the elimination of the conspirators, Cedar Creek transformed into a town haunted by fear and uncertainty. State authorities sent investigators to examine the series of mysterious deaths, but John had been careful not to leave evidence that could link him to the crimes. The community was divided between those who suspected John Miller was behind the deaths and others who believed divine justice had finally prevailed. Many residents began questioning their participation in Sarah's conviction, realizing they might have been manipulated by forces they didn't fully understand. John knew he couldn't remain in Cedar Creek indefinitely, as eventually authorities would discover his identity as the Avenger who had eliminated the conspirators. He sold his property to a family of honest settlers who promised to take good care of the land that had been the home of his life with Sarah. John used the money from the sale to help Cedar Creek's poorest families, especially those with children who had been Sarah's students, ensuring her memory was honored through acts of kindness and generosity. He also established a fund to improve the local school, determined that Sarah's educational legacy would continue to benefit future generations of children. Before leaving Cedar Creek forever, John visited Sarah's grave one last time, kneeling before the simple headstone that marked the resting place of the woman he had loved for more than 3 decades. He placed fresh flowers on the grave and whispered a promise that he would always carry her memory in his heart, and that he would try to find a way to honor the values of compassion and justice she had represented. John knew he had become a different man through his journey of revenge, darker and more dangerous than he had ever imagined being, but also determined to use his lethal skills to protect other innocents who might face similar injustices. John Miller left Cedar Creek on a foggy morning, mounted on his horse and carrying only the essentials for his new life as a wandering gunslinger. He had transformed from a peaceful farmer into something much more dangerous, a man with lethal skills and an implacable thirst for justice that would take him across the Old West in search of others who needed protection against corruption and tyranny. John knew he would never again be the simple and honest man he had been alongside Sarah, but was determined to use his transformation for a greater purpose, protecting the weak and punishing those who abused their power. In the years that followed, stories began circulating throughout the Old West about a mysterious gunslinger who appeared whenever injustice threatened to triumph over honesty. He was known only as the Widower, a middle-aged man with blue eyes cold as ice and a speed with the revolver that defied comprehension. Some stories said he had lost his family to corrupt men, and had sworn to protect others from suffering the same fate. Others claimed he was an avenging angel sent from heaven to punish those who escaped earthly justice. John never confirmed nor denied these stories, preferring to keep his identity mysterious while continuing his mission to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. John Miller's transformation from a man of peace into a legendary gunslinger was complete, but he never forgot the lessons Sarah had taught him about compassion, honesty, and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He carried his wife's memory as a light in his dark heart, always remembering that even in the pursuit of justice, it's important to maintain the humanity and dignity that separate heroes from villains. John had lost everything he loved, but had found a new purpose that would give meaning to the rest of his life, honoring Sarah's memory through acts of courage and protection for those in need. The story of John and Sarah Miller became a legend in Cedar Creek and neighboring towns, a tale about the power of true love, the corruption that can infect even the smallest communities, and the transformation that can occur when a good man is pushed beyond his limits. It was a story about justice and revenge, about the difference between law and morality, and about how sometimes it's necessary to break the rules to protect what is truly important. Above all, it was a story about how love can survive even death, inspiring acts of courage and sacrifice that echo through generations. If you've made it this far, it's because you understand that some stories touch our souls in a special way, reminding us that justice doesn't always come through official channels, and that sometimes it's necessary for ordinary people to become extraordinary to protect what is right. John Miller's journey teaches us that we all have within us the capacity for transformation, to become more than we ever imagined when facing impossible circumstances. If this story touched your heart, if you felt John's pain and the injustice suffered by Sarah, please share it with others who might need to be reminded that hope and justice still exist in this world, even in the darkest moments.